Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a North Dakota State University horticulturist from Cass County. Don, how are you?
Well, I'm doing well. You don't look like John Lamb.
I'm not John Lamb, no. My name's Kris Kurzman. I'm the digital editor here at the Forum. And John was out sick this week, so I'm filling in.
Kris is here every week. He's the one that makes this all happen, the producer.
Normally I'm kind of the guy behind the mic. Now I'm the guy behind the mic. Normally I'm the guy behind everything else, I guess. But
you're the reason why this podcast exists and continues to flow.
I love this thing every week. I love listening to you guys.
Yeah,
and
so thanks for sitting in for John. John is home with the flu, as many people are. The flu is just rampant, so we wish John well this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Get well, John. And so we're recording this. Let's see, it's February 13th, and it's really cold, Don.
It is cold.
I know we're going to get into a mailbag question here in a second, but I also had a question. So we started to see some damage to some of our shrubs from rabbits. I assume that's probably pretty common this time of the year. The rabbits getting hungry, or what's going on?
Oh, man, yeah. Because just think how long it's been since they've had green grass to nibble. And how long it's been since they've had our petunias to gnaw off. And so, yes, they are getting hungry. This time of year, they need nutrition, and they start looking for twigs on our fruit trees, our shrubs, and so they need something to eat. And of course, let's not have them eat on our landscape things because they can permanently injure some of these things. So they need to go find something else to eat. In fact, that brings up a good question. You know, some people actually will give them some like rabbit pellets or something to keep them away from their trees, shrubs. So now this is a great time to go out into your yard and see. That's why I like after a new fallen snow, I like to see where there's rabbit tracks. And because if we can stop them at their very earliest sign of whatever they found in your yard, the signs of them chewing, and you can see where they've started gnawing on the bark. And of course, they leave their fertilizer around as well. And so, different repellents can work, but the surest way is to just have some chicken wire or hardwood cloth, the metal mesh hardwood cloth. Have that on hand or run to the hardware store. And I like to keep it on hand because we don't always know where those rabbits are, what is their taste this year? Is it my roses? Is it the alpine currant hedge? Is it the fruit trees? And so I like to keep chicken wire on hand, and wherever they've just started, that's where I put chicken wire. And of course, there are some things that they always go for our rose bushes. So in the fall of the year, I always circle the rose bushes with chicken wire. Yeah, we have some newer juniper type hedges that we covered up at the end of the fall. I should say my wife does most of the gardening and landscaping. And I watch approvingly, but they hit some ornamental pines type shrubs that we have in our yard that we got with the house. And in winters past, they've never touched those. And I can't imagine any kind of pine bark or twigs being tasty to a rabbit. Like, I've had rabbits and they don't seem to like to want that stuff, but I'd assume it's because they're that hungry. Yes, right? And you bring up a good point, Kris, in that occasionally you'll see lists of rabbit-proof plants or deer-proof plants, and the problem when I've viewed those lists is I've thought, gosh, the rabbits ate that in my yard, or the deer gnawed that, even though it's on the non-eat list. And so if they're hungry enough, you're right, Kris, they'll go for almost anything. That's why it's important this time of year to be vigilant and just as they started chewing, get something around that so that they'll leave. There are repellents that have a better track record than others. One is liquid fence. One is plant skid. Both are available at garden centers. And so if you can't fence something off with chicken wire, then, try one of the repellents.
My wife also tried cayenne pepper. Yes. Like you can sprinkle cayenne pepper. I'd imagine that would probably wear off.
It does
momentarily,
and
but
that'll work on some rabbits in some locations. It all depends if they like pepper or not.
Yeah, maybe they like spicy pies.
If they're spicy, yeah, exactly. So but that's a common question. Another question. We've been opening the mailbag each week, so we've got a question here. Stephanie wrote in. She said, I'm in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and I've got a seed starting question. First of all, she said, thanks for the podcast.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for listening, Stephanie.
Yeah. She said she got a heat mat for the first time for germinating seeds. When do I stop using the heat mat? Once the seedlings sprout? Okay, and that is a great question. And of course, heat mats, which we buy, garden centers have them. They're specially for germinating seeds. It's not like what am I trying to say? A hot blanket,
right? Like an electric blanket.
Electric blanket. Yeah. That's what I'm certain. Don't use your electric blanket for germinating.
That's probably
seeds.
Too warm.
Yeah, too warm, and it'll get all wet and awful. So yes, these germinating heat pads for seeds aren't that expensive. And, oh gosh, they make seeds come up so quick. So what we do is immediately after you seed your little seed tray, water it in, cover it up with something clear, and then put it on the heat pad. And usually you can get a number of different seed trays on one because they're approximately about 12 inches wide by maybe 24 inches long. And as soon as the seedlings are up well, they've sprouted, you can see lots of good green, and when it looks like most of the seed pack has probably sprouted and is visible, then take it off of the seed mat and make sure you've got it in a good bright spot or under lights. Otherwise, they'll stretch. Yeah. So we want to get it off the heat pad. Otherwise, those little seedlings could probably cook. They like warmth for germinating, but don't want it that warm for growing on. Yeah. So thank you, Stephanie, for the question.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephanie. And speaking of my wife, she started seeds last year for the first time. She'll do it again this year. Varying success. I think some stuff was left. She started too early, and before she could get it in the ground, it got a little stretched out. So
it's common with tomatoes starting too early.
I think it probably was tomatoes. Yeah. Sure. But I will say though, that we had, timely germination on the tomatoes. We had some other issues with tomatoes, but, getting tomatoes in time, normally it's kind of like we'd barely get them in the ground in time, and then they start to come right as the season's about to end. It's a pretty labor intensive step. You got to have a little room. You got to pay attention to them, right away. But if you can get them started indoors, you're going to pay lots of dividends in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's fun to watch them grow.
Oh, and they smell nice. We have ours down in the basement, and they're in our workshop area, and I'll go into grab a wrench or something, and you can smell the new seeds of the soil. Yeah. Our
basement smells like a greenhouse.
Oh, isn't that great? All right, so we had the mailbag. It's super cold, and this topic, our main topic for the day for the show, Dot. I have to tell you, because one of my favorite concepts that you share a lot, and you and John talk about, is the idea of mental gardening.
Yes,
which is this is the best time of year for mental gardening. Putting yourself outside.
I call it thought gardening.
Thought gardening. There you go.
Gardening in the theater of the mind.
I love that. I love that idea so much because I think part of the appeal of anything like gardening or a big pursuit is the idea that you think about it a little, and you're planning and get your hopes up.
Yes, online I can visit the gardens at Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
Or the French Versailles Palace, the gardens there. I can travel in the theater of the mind.
It's a lovely notion. Well, a part of that is in our main topic today is you've assembled a nice list here of terms.
Do you speak gardening?
I'm looking over this, and I think I maybe speak a little bit. I'm not fluent. I'd say I'm passable.
There's a language all its own,
yeah.
And it's funny. I always like to mention especially to experienced gardeners that are talking with someone that's new to gardening and enjoying learning it. that don't take for granted that people are understanding what it is you're talking about. For example, my mom would say, okay, well, it's time now to set out the tomatoes. Well, what? Set them out on the driveway? Set them out in the sun?
Find your terms.
What does
What's
setting out mean? And I can chuckle when my mom said, well, Grandma gave her the slip. Well, I thought, what, playing hide and seek.
Something from the boudoir?
Yeah, slip. And of course, slip is a traditional term for taking a cutting of a plant, and you still hear slip. So many of these terms are still in active use. You read gardening books, and they use these terms, but they're not always intuitive. And so I thought it was fun to go through some of these. Someday I'm going to write a book about the language that gardeners speak that isn't always intuitive, and we need sometimes to translate it for others. And so that's what we're doing today. We're translating gardening speak.
All right. Well, let's get started here, Don, and you can expound upon these as you'd like here. So the first one on your list is pinch.
Yeah, pinch.
What is pinching?
Ouch. A pinch.
Would you wear green on St. Patrick's Day?
Yes,
is that what you got pinched?
Exactly. So anyway, a pinch means in plants to use the thumb and forefinger to remove the tip growth. And now this is done to encourage the plant to branch out. So you pinch the center growing point of plants on each branch. For example, geraniums. If you pinch about this time of year, if you're wintering them indoors, they've had kind of maybe some spindly winter growth, and you pinch the plants back. Yeah. You could use the shears if you want, but oftentimes just the thumb and forefinger do. And by pinching out those growing points, you'll encourage branching below that, so you get a healthier plant. For example, when you're planting petunias out into a container, if you pinch them at the time of planting, it'll encourage them to branch out. So instead of just one spindly shoot, you'll have multiple shoots that come below the point of pinching.
It's a nice way to pinch.
It is
you're not pranking anybody.
Yeah, so we pinch back our plants.
Yeah. You mentioned this one earlier, setting out. So setting out doesn't mean just setting out. What does setting out actually
Setting
do?
out doesn't mean going on a journey. Setting out is a term for transplanting out into the gardening. So when my mom used to say, okay, it's time to set out the tomato plants, what she meant was it's time to transplant those starter plants out into the garden. So setting out is another term for transplanting them out into the garden.
It kind of does invoke a journey. It's the next stage in your plant's journey, right? It's heading out to the garden.
That's a good way to look at it.
On the road there. Our next one here, heavy soil.
Sounds like it would be in a bag that would be heavy to lift, doesn't it?
Right,
heavy
like
soil.
A heavy soil. Yeah,
maybe it is. But heavy soil, when you encounter that in a book where it mentions that this perennial does not like heavy soil. Heavy soil refers to soil type that is very high in clay content. And of course, in the Red River Valley here,
a lot of
our soil is heavy.
Very heavy.
So clay packs hard. And so heavy soil is often, we often need to amend. Well, there's another gardening term that maybe is on our list.
Add
or
it
should
to the
be.
list, sure.
Yeah, amend. We add things to heavy soil to make it looser and lighter and better drained. Heavy soil often does not drain well. For example, if we get heavy rains in the Red River Valley's clay soil, things can become waterlogged, and the water just doesn't drain off. So with a heavy soil, we amend it with things like compost, peat moss, other organic matter to make it a lighter soil that's going to drain better. And roots need air. They don't want this soggy, damp, heavy soil. So oftentimes you'll see when you're reading books on perennials that they prefer a light soil, a well-drained soil, which would be the opposite of a heavy soil.
Can a soil be too light? Is it if it's sandy or if it has too much plant matter in it?
Exactly. If people are listening to this that are in the sandy soils of Minnesota and on east, they might say, well, gosh, it might be kind of nice to have some heavy soil because I wouldn't have to water as often.
Yeah.
And so sandy soils, I'm glad you brought it up, Kris. Sandy light soils, they can be too light. They can almost be as difficult to grow as heavy soil. So the antidote for both too light soil and too heavy soil is organic matter.
Okay.
In a too light soil, the organic matter will give some moisture holding component, and then they won't have to water as often.
Oh, interesting. What kind of having never grown up in a place that has sandy soil, what sort of product or what would you look for to amend?
Compost,
just
organic
compost,
materials,
sure.
compost, or peat moss.
Okay.
Really anything organic of that nature added in.
Darned. See, I'm learning stuff too.
We all
not fluent.
We all learn. Count the day lost. You don't learn something new.
Well, that's my second favorite thing you say on this show, Don. Move on here. Heavy soil, blight. So BLIGHT. If you encounter that as you're reading a book or seeing it on a website or something, blight. What is blight?
Yeah, blight. We hear that a lot with tomatoes. Do your tomatoes have the blight?
Oh, yeah. Been there.
And of course, blight is kind of a generic term for a disease. In tomatoes, we refer to the blight as a fungal type disease that causes the leaves to be spotted and turn yellow. So blight is kind of a generic term. There are different types of blights, fusarium blight, late blight of potatoes, etc. So that's kind of a generic term. If someone says my tomatoes have the blight, you kind of need to go on from there. Okay, what type of blight? Is it on the fruit? Is it on the leaves?
Like blossom end rot.
Blossom end rot would be
a
blight. And of course, that's not caused by a disease, organism. It's caused by the plant can't take calcium up out of the roots.
Sure.
So, but yeah, generic term.
Okay.
Blight.
Yeah. That makes sense. Next up, rest period.
Rest period. That might be what I need after an afternoon of weeding in the garden.
Yeah.
But rest period actually refers to a dormancy that is needed, such as in bulbs. Tulips. Tulip bulbs need a rest period. Okay, we plant tulip bulbs in the fall of the year, and they know enough not to just grow in the fall because, well, they get frozen off in winter. Yeah. So they have a rest period that is needed of a number of months, which corresponds to winter. So you plant the tulip bulbs in the fall of the year. They naturally inside know we need this rest period over winter, and once that rest period is accomplished, soil warms up, they start to grow then.
Interesting.
In fact, if you want to force a pot of tulips, you put them in the refrigerator. You can't just plant them and they start to grow. They need their rest period. So you pot them up, put them in the refrigerator for that rest period, and then after the rest period is accomplished, they'll start to grow.
That seems a little devious. Like, I think those bulbs want to come up properly, but no, I'm joking.
Yes.
Rest period. Okay, good to know that one. Weed. Well, I thought I knew what a weed was, but it looks like you have a more a better clarification of what a weed is.
Yes, a weed. I enjoy the term a weed because I get lots of emails from people that send a picture of a plant and ask, "Is this a weed?" Now, this is an interesting concept. Okay, when all plants originated and were created or evolved, was there a certain class of plants that just are weeds, serve no good purpose, but let's just louse up gardeners by having this type of plant that's a weed. Well, there really aren't any plants like that. All plants have a part in an ecosystem somewhere. But there are certain plants that annoy us. So a weed is technically defined as any plant growing where we don't want them. If roses send up a bunch of suckers and they're coming up in one of my nice perennials, well, that sucker of a rose is a weed. Yeah. So a weed is any plant growing where you don't want it. So even very nice plants can become weeds. Oh, for example, in farm fields. If the next year, the year after corn was planted, if a corn is growing up in soybeans, well, that corn is a weed in that location.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, and that's there's designations that I assume like must be the USDA would make about noxious weeds because there are certain classes of weeds in agriculture I think if you see Russian thistle.
Yes.
I think is
For
a big
example,
one.
each state has a noxious weed list. So, for example, in North Dakota, the North Dakota Department of Agriculture has, I believe it's 11 things that are on a noxious weed list. Yes, and Canadian thistle is one of them.
Okay.
And it's because they are so rampant, they spread easily, and they're hard to control.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain things, certain plants that are actually legally listed as weeds.
But it's still somebody saying we don't want this here. It's just the state of North Dakota versus an individual gardener.
Well, for example, quackgrass, which most of us consider a weed. By the way, that's not on the North Dakota noxious weed list, but it's annoying to gardeners. Quackgrass was introduced into this country as a good, hardy, vigorous grass.
Yeah.
Well, and that it is.
It is, yeah.
And so many of these things that now have become weeds were brought into this country for a purpose of some.
I have a great way to sort of talk about this issue, Don, as you're talking. So in our first house, we're currently in our second house, but at our first house, we had a little teeny tiny backyard. And we shared a sort of a backyard area with a couple of other lots. This is a pretty dense neighborhood, and there was a giant elm tree that shaded everything, and it was actually really nice because for us it was on the the west side of the house, so we got tons of shade from this big tree. But that also meant that I have
a feeling I know where you're going with
this. If it's the smell of cutting creeping Charlie, yeah. So anyway, there's this. We have this tiny yard that was almost always shaded. It was shaded half the day, and instead of grass, there was creeping Charlie everywhere. And at first I was like, oh, gross, creeping Charlie. We got to do something about it. Well, you don't do anything about creeping Charlie. Like you sort of live with it. But after a while, I learned that, and I would mow it. I would cut it back and whatever. And it smells. I like the smell of cut creeping Charlie. And then I did a little bit of research, and you find out that creeping Charlie is implemented as a cover plant, and
introduced as a hardy, vigorous ground cover. And that it is.
And so then I'm sure. Me and my neighbors probably would we have preferred to have grass there? Probably. Sure. None of us really had the means to resod our entire lawn. So for the most part, we just sort of grudgingly accepted the creeping Charlie there. And I struggle to call that a weed.
Exactly. Now, I thought where you were going with this when you said under a big elm tree, I thought you were probably addressing the worst weed in my flower beds and gardens, and that is elm seedlings.
Oh.
When they drop their seeds and they pop up all over. So in that case, those elm seedlings are weeds to me.
Oh, my gosh.
So when people send me something and say, is this a weed? Then my response usually is, well, is it growing where you want it or not?
Right.
But some things are just classic weeds, such as Canada thistle.
Yep, there you go. All right, next one on our list here, a pesticide.
Pesticide, when you see that term, it's an umbrella term for killing a pest. So under that umbrella term, we have insecticides, which kill insects. We have herbicides, which kill plants. Usually weeds.
Yeah.
But, some of the herbicides can kill our tomatoes too if applied in the wrong spot. So, and then we have fungicides, which kill fungus and diseases, and rodenticides, rodents, mice, and things like that. So under the pesticide umbrella, you have all these other isides, insecticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, each killing kind of that specific thing.
Yeah, I think it's if you're a beginner gardener and you're unfamiliar with these terms, I think it's always a good practice to, if you have a problem and you're trying to buy something to a product, make sure you read it carefully and make sure it takes care of the thing you want it to take care of.
The label is actually a legal document. So applying something against what that label says is illegal. Oh. And there's good reason for that. If we apply an herbicide, for example, to somewhere that is not on the label, you can be liable for doing that. For example, if you were using a farm-type chemical in your home yard and it drifted onto your neighbors and killed all their shrubs and tomato plants, you could be liable for not following the label. So it
Read
is
your
serious.
labels.
I mean, not to get too heavy, but yes, the label is very important.
This is gardening serious business, Don.
It is.
And then the last one here before we take a quick break, you mentioned this term before, a slip.
Yes. Now, this is one of the least intuitive things, a slip. I don't know it'd be fun to check the origin of that, but a slip is a term for a cutting. You take a cutting, such as I'd like to propagate a houseplant. So I'm going to take a slip or a cutting off of that to produce roots.
But not all plants you can't take a slip from just any plant.
Right?
Right?
That's true.
Like there are some that obviously that won't.
Right. Yeah. One way to tell, okay, will this houseplant propagate from a slip or cutting is if it tends to grow branches, vining or branches, leaves coming off branches, as opposed to if all the leaves are coming out of a central crown. For example, picture peace lily. That's come to be known as the funeral plant. Okay, the peace lily.
Yeah.
Okay, all of those leaves originate out of a single point down at soil level. It doesn't really have branching stems as such, and so it won't work just to take a leaf off of a peace lily and stick it in water or media and get it to root. It just won't do that. Those have to be divided. And so cuttings, you look for, are there leaves spaced along a stem or a branch? And then you take the tip cutting with several of those, remove the lower leaves from that branch, put it in, and it's going to root.
There you go. All right. With that, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more vocabulary of gardening.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, and we're back with more vocabulary of gardening. Don is taking us through some. I guess they're not. They're just vocabulary that's specific to gardening, or terms that they probably mean something in a different context, but you can talk about in gardening.
Experienced gardeners, these terms roll off their tongue, and other people listening might not know what they mean, or a new gardener trying to figure all this out might not know exactly what they mean. But you do encounter them quite a bit also in literature.
Yeah, and some of these make sense a little bit. I'm sure your regular co-host, by the way, who is John Lamb, who is out sick today. He's also a big word nerd. John's always good for a pun, and some of these, like the thing that always appeals to us word people about puns and other words is how deep they are, but then also they're also connected, right? So even though I think we mentioned it when we talked about the term setting out, which is to put your plants into the garden, but it's also like setting out on a journey. So they have this rich double meaning. All of a sudden these words have more dimension.
So yes, exactly. So they're not totally disconnected from reality.
Totally.
Yeah. They have deeper meanings. I love it.
Well, let's get back to your list here. So you've got forcing. So that sounds forceful, but
it sounds kind of unkind, forcing a plant. But that is the gardening term. In fact, I think I mentioned it just a few minutes ago when we talked about tulips. Tulips having a rest period, but we can force them into blooming. You pot them up, you force them to bloom by giving them their rest period in the refrigerator, and it forces them then into bloom. So we bring plants into growth or bloom outside of their normal season, such as, instead of tulips blooming in the spring, well, the garden centers are full of potted tulips that you can buy. Yeah. And so they have forced them.
And I suppose there's a lot of demand for that because people don't just want roses one time a year, right? They want roses multiple times a year. So you're gonna, if you want to supply these as a product or something for people to sell, say at Valentine's Day, you're going to have to force some plants.
Right. So those roses have been forced in large greenhouses and large growing areas.
Interesting. Yeah. Next on your term is one that's interesting to me because I work in this, but it's media.
Yes. What is that? Radio, TV?
There's lots of things. There's social media and there's
social media,
asocial media, all sorts of medias.
So media is the term for the mix in which plants are growing. So when we talk about taking cuttings of plants, okay, there are two ways you can root cuttings. Some people say, well, I just take a cutting off of a house plant and stick it in a glass of water. Well, actually, there's a way to get better roots, and that is you'll see it listed as, instead of using a glass of water, root them in media. Okay, so media is a mix, a more solid type mix into which plants are grown. So a media could be a potting mix. A media could be vermiculite, which are the little kind of golden flakes that you see.
Oh, yeah.
Perlite are the little white crunchy beads. Media could be compost. You could use that as your media. So a media is the material in which plants are growing. So, if somebody didn't know that or wasn't familiar with that in gardening and somebody said, okay, well, I'm going to use some media, that's not really intuitive, is it?
Well, I mean, does that mean that you just turn the radio on for the plants?
Yes.
Like they need to grow in some media. They need to listen to talk radio or something. I don't know.
I love it.
All right. Next up, you have direct seeding.
Yes. Now, you encounter that term, direct seeding, much when, for example, zinnia seeds, the beautiful flowering zinnias. Some people say, oh, did you start them early indoors, or did you direct seed them? So that refers to instead of starting your zinnia seeds early under lights and on the heat pads, etc., and then transplanting that out, instead, direct seeding means you took that seed and planted it directly into your flower bed outside. And of course, the reason for starting things early indoors is to get them to bloom quicker or produce quicker. So tomato seeds, we start early indoors, get a plant, and then we set out that plant into the garden.
There we go.
We normally do not direct seed tomato seeds directly out into the garden because it might be October before you get your first ripe tomato.
If they come up at all, right?
But now, one of our podcasts that we did a number of weeks ago was Burpee has a new tomato that they're offering that they say works by direct seeding.
Wow.
You don't start the seeds early. You plant that little seed right out in the garden, and they say it will catch up and grow. So I'm going to try it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so direct seeding. Means we don't use transplants or starter plants. We plant that little seed directly out.
I got to think that direct seeding is how a lot of people, when they probably first set out gardening, they're like, well, if I buy these seeds, I just put them in the yard, and then exactly, and then I get corn in a little bit.
Because now some types of plants, especially garden plants, direct seeding is the way to go because they grow quick, produce. For example, radishes. You don't start radishes indoors. You direct seed. Yeah. Lettuce, you direct seed.
Yep.
And it's interesting, like you mentioned. Okay, when you go to the seed rack in a garden center or hardware store, the seed rack, all of these seeds are side by side. The tomato seed. The cabbage seed is right beside the radish seed.
Yeah.
And yet cabbage, if you direct seed, that's going to take forever to form a nice big head. So you usually use starter plants for those. So it is interesting. And that's what experience teaches a person. These things can be direct seeded. That's the normal way to do it. These things have to be started early.
There's always so much to learn, folks. But if you're new at this, it's okay. Just take your time, read your packages. And you can always ask Don if you have questions. Next up on your list is pot bound.
Pot bound.
What is to be pot bound?
That means a plant has been in that pot for quite a while, and the roots are all circling around.
Oh, yeah.
And
I've seen that before,
for example,
sure.
a pot bound house plant would be one that's grown for a number of years in that same pot, and you take it out of that pot, and you see the roots all whirled around inside. Now, this is especially important with trees and shrubs. that you buy. And when you go to plant them, when you slip it out of the pot, if it's pot bound and you see all these roots circling around the outside, those roots cannot stay in that circular fashion. For example, a tree planted just out of the pot and down into the soil, if it's pot bound, those roots stay in that circle fashion, and eventually they will strangle the tree. We need to cut those roots, tease them outward so that the roots go in their normal position, growing outward and not in a circle pot-bound fashion.
Yeah, it might be, if you're growing houseplants and you have a plant that, one, seems to be fairly large for its container, but then two, you can't seem to water it enough. You might not be to blame. True. You might not be the one who's not giving it enough water. It might be sucking down so much water because it needs it, but it doesn't have enough media in there to hold it, right?
Exactly. Very true.
I know I've seen that with houseplants before, where somebody's like, "Oh, I can't grow houseplants. I can't keep them watered." And I'm like, "Well, if you have them in the proper container, they should be able to hold enough water. You shouldn't have to keep watering them."
It might be pot bound.
It might be pot bound. Yeah. Maybe sort of an opposite problem, a plant that has or doesn't like wet feet. Well, nobody likes wet feet.
No.
I hate walking through the kitchen and my socks get wet. And then and then my socks are all wet, and then I've got to complain to everybody. But plants are the same.
Exactly. And sometimes you see this in literature that perennials, a certain type of perennial doesn't like wet feet. And I always think, when I read that, I think, gosh, let's get a towel and dry those feet off. So wet feet refers to they just can't tolerate soil that is consistently soggy. A classic example is lilacs. Now, last spring, we just had continual rain for the spring through the first part of summer. And many of our soils, especially the heavy soils, stayed just too wet and soggy. And so some plants were forced to have wet feet. Lilacs can't take wet feet, and many lilacs were lost. Some plants like wet feet. Willows are used to growing in kind of boggy, low areas, ditches, etc. So willows like wet feet. But many plants don't and can't tolerate that.
So do your research. Make sure you, if you're picking a location for something like a lilac or something, make sure that.
If you see listed a perennial doesn't like wet feet, now we know what it means.
Yeah. Next up, a flat. I know from my dad's greenhouse days what a flat is.
Oh, sure. So you know what a flat is.
Yeah. It's not
a tire with a hole in it.
It's not a type of shoe either. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So a flat, and of course in the greenhouse, Mary and I had a greenhouse for about 25 years, and the term flat just rolls off your tongue. How many flats of petunias are we going to do today? A flat is the greenhouse term for a tray. And typically they're 10 inches by 20 to 20 or 20 inches, 10 inches by 20. 10 by 20 was the standard flat in a greenhouse.
And they'd usually hold 10 six-packs.
Yes, exactly.
There you go.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yep. That's super.
Yeah, and you might you'll more than likely encounter that if you go to a garden center or a greenhouse.
Yes.
And they might use that term to say like, oh, yeah, how many cabbages you want? Maybe like a flat, something like that.
Flat. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Next up, self-cleaning. Well, that sounds like a nice thing. Plants often have dirt on them. They should clean themselves.
Self-cleaning isn't just about an oven that's listed as being self-cleaning. Plants, if a plant is called self-cleaning, and usually this refers to annual flowers that you might put in a container. They're self-cleaning. That means the withered flower petals just drop off cleanly without you having to cut them off or pull them off or pinch them off. So self-cleaning is wonderful. Otherwise, if a plant isn't self-cleaning, if it leaves that old, dried, withered flower head on, you probably have to physically pinch or cut it off.
So something you might consider, you might like a self-clean, if you have to buy a plant for your office or something where somebody can't give it a lot of attention.
And if it says self-cleaning, that is a really good characteristic for that plant to have. Yeah. It means it takes less care.
Yeah. On the flip side of that is deadheading, I believe, if I'm reading this correctly. And at first I thought is this a Jerry Garcia thing, Deadhead's Grateful Dead. What is deadheading?
Deadheading, deadheading is what you need to do if the plant isn't self-cleaning. If the flowers won't shed their petals off, if they leave this kind of ratty-looking dead flower head, then you need to deadhead. You need to cut off that dead head. And
I'm picturing geraniums.
Yes, geraniums. Yep, you need to remove that. And in addition to just looking better, there's a good reason for that too. Deadheading removes the developing seed pod because many of these plants, once they've developed seed, that indicates to them that their life cycle is nearing its end and they won't produce as many flowers. So deadheading prevents that seed pod from being formed, and then it will keep them producing flowers longer. So both for looks and to keep more flowers producing, deadheading is important.
You had mentioned geraniums. My dad was a huge fan of geraniums, and I got to say, geraniums have gorgeous blossoms when they're flowering. But when that blossom head starts to go south, boy, the geranium itself kind of goes south.
Yes.
You gotta clip that thing off, right?
Yes, it really does. Because man, talk about detracting from the blossoms that might be there that look decent, but the old ones take away. Plus, if you don't deadhead at all, they likely won't keep producing more flowers. Your dad was right.
Don't don't say that too loud. No, I'm kidding. All right, we've got a few more to get to, but we're going to take one more quick little break, and we'll be back with more vocabulary of gardening. If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts. And we're back with more vocabulary of gardening with Don. I assume you've been collecting these for a while. You've got a file of these somewhere, vocab words.
I have, and that's why I say someday I'm going to write a book with all these. In fact, we aren't even going to get to all of them today. We'll do a part 2, maybe another month or so.
Yeah.
So yeah, we aren't even getting to all of them.
Barely scratching the surface
exactly.
of, and I think if you ever remember the old aphorism about Eskimos having 100 words for snow.
Yes.
There's a similar concept where there's so many slang terms for money, right? Dough, scratch, bread. And the more impact that something has on a society or within a population or something, the more words you have for it. So Eskimos, like snow is like a lot of things.
Well, yeah,
for
they
them,
can't just have one word for that.
So they got to have a bunch of. And I grew up in North Dakota. I know the difference between that like super dry snow that falls when it's really cold versus like
or when it's kind of crystally like.
Yeah. There or when it blows around, it does different things. Anyway, I can totally see that, and I can see going through this list.
I like the light, fluffy stuff.
Yeah,
but we only have one word for it.
We do, but we've got tons of modifiers for it, right?
That's true.
There's snowman snow. There's heart attack snow. There's
snowball snow.
Yep. So we've got all these great words for snow, and similarly, there are lots of great words inside gardening. Let's get to your next one on your list. Looks like it's following our last term, which was deadheading. Spent blossoms.
Yes.
A spent blossom must be something that you deadhead. Right?
You got it.
Yeah.
And so when you see in literature that remember to remove the spent blossoms to encourage continued blossoming, it means that spent blossom is the withered, dead blossom. And so we need to remove spent blossoms.
Yeah, it's not
unless
like
it's
money.
self-cleaning.
Unless it's self-cleaning.
Right.
All this stuff just kind of
works together.
Yeah, we sound like professional gardeners here. Well, you do. My job is to make you sound more professional. The next term here you've got is cross.
Yeah, cross doesn't mean you're irritable.
Uh-huh.
Cross refers to taking the pollen from one flower and transferring it to another.
Oh,
you cross plants. So that's what plant breeders do.
Okay.
They will take the good, they want to combine the good characteristics of one plant and the good characteristics characteristics of another plant into one plant, so they cross the two by transferring pollen from one to the other. And then you have a hybrid.
You've got a hybrid, right? And that's also an indication where I'm assuming that the term to cross-pollinate or to cross plants, assuming it comes from gardening and from growing and maintaining plants. That's also something we use in lots of other parts of our world, right?
Oh,
like we
what?
talked about, well, if you say like a video game is a cross hybrid between this type of video game and this type of video game, you would say like, oh, it's a cross between, or it's like a cross hybrid between these things.
Same thing.
It's the same kind of thing.
Principle.
Yeah, same principle. Totally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I should mention too that sometimes our bees cross pollinate plants.
They do it for us.
So it's not just a science-y type thing that somebody in a lab is doing. So bees can cross. They aren't fussy which flowers they go to, so they're traveling along doing their thing, and they can cross-pollinate for us. They can do the crosses.
We used to do pollinating with. I used a little like a little. It was like a Dremel tool, but it has like a little vibrating to it, and you touch the tip of one and then go into another one.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Next on your list, coming true. Well, it's not like dreams come true to a Disney princess or something. What is coming true?
So if a seed comes true, it means that you could collect, at the end of a growing season, you could collect seed from a tomato or a marigold. You could collect the seed, and then the next spring you could plant that seed. And if it gives you back that same thing, then it comes true.
Oh, interesting.
So now many tomatoes, if they weren't a hybrid developed by a special cross, if it's, for example, an heirloom type tomato, those, if you save the seed and plant the seed, it will come true. It will give you the same thing from which you collected the plant. Now, many newer flowers are hybrids that don't come true. For example, I've saved seed from wave petunias. The wave petunias are beautiful. They vine and travel, lots of great flowers. Wave petunias are wonderful. And I've tried collecting the seed from them because the seed's expensive, and then I've tried planting it, but they didn't come true. They produced something that was of lesser quality, smaller blossoms. They weren't as flower packed, and so some things come true, some things don't. Hybrid seeds that were created by special crosses oftentimes will not come true. They kind of revert back to one of the parents.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it is.
And there's a lot to talk about there. But I, think of a lot of folks who are maybe starting to try to save seeds. I know that's becoming a thing. One, because the cost of seeds is high, and then two, I think people want to know how to do every part of the process, right?
Right.
And so, and that includes saving your seeds.
Saving seeds is.
But this is something
that
this is something that you got to watch out for.
We got to make sure they'll come true.
They got to make sure they come true. Interesting. Next on your list, an eye. Well, I know what an eye is. I got two of those.
Yes. No, I love these. And I don't know where some of these terms just developed. So an eye is on a potato. Potatoes have eyes.
Oh, of course, potatoes. Yeah.
Yep. That's the little indentations. And of course, that's where the new growth is going to come. After the potato has met its rest period and can start growing again, that growth comes out of the eyes. And so potatoes is probably the most common thing that we refer to as having eyes, but also peonies have eyes. When you're planting peonies and reading about planting peonies, it will indicate that the depth of planting is very important. It will say, make sure that the uppermost eye is only about an inch or two below soil surface.
Okay.
So it says, look for the uppermost eye. It doesn't always tell you what the eye is, but the eye is the raised bud that you will see down in the roots. It's very visible on a peony. Those whitish or pinkish buds are referred to as eyes.
So I had no idea there was anything other than potatoes that had eyes.
Sure.
Are there anything other than potatoes and peonies?
Those are the most common that we see that have eyes. Occasionally with other kind of bulb type things, For example, glads, the little kind of bud up at the top, is sometimes referred to as an eye as well.
Interesting. Oh, cool. Does that mean, I'm sorry, I got one more follow-up question. Does that mean potatoes and peonies are related?
No.
No. It's
no,
just
yeah,
a completely...
you would think so. Gosh, how come these have eyes and many other things don't have eyes? But yeah, the potato and peony, that's an interesting question, though. No, totally unrelated.
Completely unrelated.
Unrelated
That's
plant
crazy.
families.
Oh man,
it is.
It's so fascinating.
It is
so much. There's so much nuance. There's so much to discover right out in your garden.
World of plants.
Exactly. Yeah. Moving on here. Another one you have is hardy.
Sometimes I'm asked, is this plant hardy? Now, hardy, the term just plain hardy could mean two different things. Okay, usually it refers to as being winter hardy, able to survive our winters in a given location, winter hardy. But if you just say hardy, hardy could mean, is it vigorous? Is this plant hardy, vigorous, going to grow fast and good? So I always like to use the term winter hardy. Okay. So you're creeping Charlie, not only being winter hardy, but just hardy because it grows a lot. And so I like the term winter hardy. Now that means a plant will survive, a tree, shrub, perennial flower will survive in your growing zone. Yeah. So, and of course, what is winter hardy in? And it's important, to talk about the area that you're talking, because what is winter hardy in South Florida isn't going to be winter hardy in Fargo, North Dakota.
Right. Well, and then I think any sort of I guess a biome or a certain area where I'm thinking of wild grasses exhibit a hardiness on the prairie where there's lots of wind, right? So they've got they root deeply because they have to sustain through periods of drought, right? So those all contribute to that plant's hardiness versus, say, your willow, which like to have wet feet and was hardy in more wetter.
Exactly. That brings up the good point, Kris, about microclimate. The microclimate, such as, within the same winter hardiness zone, there's a difference between a plant that is growing in a sheltered yard in the old part of town versus on the windswept prairie. Yeah. So you're definitely, that's a good point, that even within that same winter hardiness, there may be little microclimates that affect it as well, or wet feet.
Yeah, like wet feet, yeah. Next term you have here, we've got just a couple more. Leggy. What does it mean when something is leggy?
Leggy. Oftentimes a person might hear that one's seedlings that you're growing indoors have become leggy. And you'll see that in literature quite often, but that means they've developed a spindly appearance, that usually they haven't gotten enough light. And so they're stretching towards the light, they become spindly or leggy.
Now
we can prevent if something is leggy, we can pinch it back. One of our first terms, we can pinch it back to encourage branching.
Yeah. I wonder if the origin of some of these terms.
Yes,
it's how did somebody say, it's got, I suppose it looks like it's got legs, or maybe, or it's running fast, like it has legs, I guess.
Well, that's possible too.
Could be, yeah. The crown of a plant. What is a plant's crown?
Yes, the crown of a plant. That is the point at soil level in which all the branches or leaf stems are originating. So the crown of a perennial plant, such as daylilies, the crown of the daylily is where all of those strap-like leaves meet the roots. It's right at soil level. Now, the crown of a shade tree, and that's why these nuances, the crown of a shade tree is the canopy.
That's what I would have guessed.
Thinking? Yeah, the crown of a tree is up there. The crown of a peony is not at the top. The crown of a peony is where all the stems meet the roots at soil level.
Well, that's a really good distinction.
It depends whether you're talking about a tree or a perennial, or in case of shrubs, also the crown is down where the stems meet the roots.
So then every plant is going to have a crown, but it's going to be in a different spot.
In a different location.
So it's good to know what that term is. Last one, I think I've heard you talk about this term before, planting on a hill or planting in a hill.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Because sometimes when you buy a seed packet, such as squash, cucumbers, or melons, it will say you can either plant in a row or plant in a hill. Now, I was lucky to have gardened with my mom since I was about 5 years old. And so when it came time to plant the cucumbers or squash, Mom would say, okay, we're going to plant these in a hill. So I watched and learned what a hill was. Now, you might think, and some gardeners, okay, logically, you think, okay, I'm going to plant these in a hill. I'm going to mound up the soil, right? I'm going to make a little hill and then plant the seed. That's not what a hill means. Okay, a hill means a grouping. So rather than planting just one little cucumber seed, you plant, or squash seed, melon seed, you plant a grouping. So a hill is a grouping of maybe 4 or 5, maybe up to 6 seeds in a little closely spaced grouping. And it's used especially with the vine type crops, cucumbers, melon, squash. So a hill doesn't mean you raise the soil. And you think about, okay, if I raised that soil, made a little mound, planted the seeds, that little hill is going to dry out awfully quick. And where the root's going to go. So anyway, a hill just means a grouping. But that's one of those that it's totally not intuitive.
Yeah,
planting them in a hill.
Do you see people make that mistake?
Yes.
Is that a common mistake?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not going to say I've made that mistake, but I could see myself making that mistake.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Based off of planting in a hill.
And I've noticed the seed packs don't always specify or explain what that means.
Yeah.
It can be planted in a hill.
They don't assume that folks like me get out and garden.
That's why I always suggest to experienced gardeners when you're talking, and it's fun. Gardeners love to pass along what they've learned over the years. But I always mention when you're talking with people that are getting excited about learning about gardening, listen to yourself. Listen to the words that you're telling them to see if they're intuitive. So when you're explaining to somebody, cucumbers, plant them in a hill. Explain what that actually means.
Yeah. Yep. Be a good steward of this language that you are passing along to others. Yeah.
Good point. None of us are mind readers.
Right. And everybody's new. And, given how there's always more growing interest, new people getting into gardening, there's always going to be those moments where you misunderstand something or whatever.
Well, yes. It's fun. You mentioned new gardeners. We are all new gardeners, and here's why. Because each upcoming growing season is new. There are none that are exactly identical. No growing season has the same temperature, the same moisture conditions, the same. Okay, so we're all approaching the upcoming garden season as new.
That is such an excellent point.
And so you really need to stay on top of your, game, watch, learn, observe. And so we are all approaching this upcoming growing season as a new gardener.
Oh, that's the kind of wisdom you only get on this podcast, Don, and why I
We're
enjoy
all in this together. That's why we call it growing together.
Exactly, and it's also great too. Like there's again, all of this sort of reinforces the sense that one is that gardening depends on so much on personal relationships, oral tradition, people talking to each other, people reading each other's books, people writing books, people be willing to share your knowledge, folks like yourself, Don.
Okay, thank you, Kris. Thanks for joining today.
Oh, my pleasure. This was a lot of fun. It was kind of fun to sort of. I'm more than happy to. I can't wait for John to get back in here and do this part because John, you do a great job. And
it's been great
feel
doing
better.
The program with you.
Absolutely. But let's say there's some folks listening. And they've listened to this point and they put up with me long enough, and they're like, wait a minute, I got more questions for Don. I came across this term in a gardening book. How do they get a hold of you?
Send me an email, donald.kinzler, Kinzler, at ndsu.edu. Donald.kinzler at ndsu.edu. And it's great to hear from listeners.
That's right. And by all means, send Don photos.
Yes.
If you've got questions about a plant or
wondering is this a weed? Yeah, a
or
photo.
should I deadhead
Yes.
this spent blossom? Like all those questions, you love photos. I think that's great. And by all means, ask us a question. Tell us what you think about the podcast too, if you listen, and be sure to tell others about this great podcast too.
Thanks everyone for listening.